The House Judiciary and Civil Law Committee held a hearing on the Minnesota Migration Act, House File 3850, which establishes reparations for the American descendants of chattel slavery who reside in the state of Minnesota. The bill was written by Trern Cruz and formatted and introduced by State Representative John Thompson. The companion bill was introduced by Senator Hurd. The bill is an extension of the St. Paul Recovery Act. The St. Paul Recovery Act is designed to secure reparations for the American descendants of chattel slavery who reside in St. Paul. The Minnesota Migration Act is designed to secure full and complete reparations for the American descendants of chattel slavery who reside in the state of Minnesota.
2 minutes. I made the decision that it was more important to hear more voices instead of letting a single person eat up all the time. So we are going to time you, and no disrespect is meant. It's actually out of respect to your fellow testifiers that we're going to keep everybody to 2 minutes. The first, yeah, Representative Thompson.
Chair, with all due respect, you're absolutely right. I just had the keys to the car, and this is totally driven by community. And so, yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative Thompson. First on the list, I have Reverend Ronnie Patterson. Please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Uh-oh.
We can move to the next person on the list, and we'll come back to that person. Reverend Spence, if you're here, if you can introduce yourself and go ahead with your testimony. All right, I see Trern Cruz has his camera on, so we'll go to you next. If you can introduce yourself for the record and then go ahead with your testimony, please.
Hello, I'm Trern Cruz. I'm a St. Paul resident and part of the St. Paul Recovery Act Legislative Advisory Committee that focuses on reparations for the city of St. Paul that was passed January 13th, 2021. I have just a quick statement to read. Black Minnesotans have contributed greatly to the state of Minnesota. In the United States, Casville Bullard helped build the Minnesota State Capitol. Likewise, and other Black Americans, likewise, 300 enslaved Black Americans built the nation's capital, but were never paid. According to Demos, the racial wealth gap is substantial and is driven by public policy. Minnesota has some of the worst disparities in the nations as it pertains to housing. Home ownership is the path to creating generational wealth. White Americans have $100 trillion worth of wealth. Black Americans have $2.6 trillion worth of wealth. And again, the racial wealth gap is substantial and is driven by public policy. Some examples of public policy are racial covenants, which were here in Minnesota for a very long time. 3 strikes and you're out, slavery, the lynching period, and many others. The New England Journal of Medicine said if reparations were in place, the Black community would not have been impacted by COVID-19 as severely as we were. And we believe that reparations, as the New England Journal of Medicine believes, that the reparations is the quickest and most efficient ways to close the racial wealth gap and the disparities in health, housing, employment, and the rest of the disparities that impact Black people's lives. So I think I think this is a really great bill and is a pathway to closing the racial wealth gap and starting healing in America. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next on the list, I have Minister Toya. If you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself for the record, and then go ahead with your testimony.
I'm Minister Toya Woodland. I'm with ICIO Ministries, also St. Paul Recovery Act Steering Committee here in St. Paul. So my thing is that we suffer here in Minnesota by being the lowest of everything. Right now, the median income for the average Black family here in the state of Minnesota is $15,200, while the median income for the average white family here in Minnesota is $60,000 annually. Also, we represent 13% of the population, yet we make up 53% of all children that are removed by CPS. We also, one in every 4 Black women here in Minnesota that go through labor and delivery, 1 in 4 die during labor and delivery. We face some of the biggest disparities here in Minnesota. We face some of the lowest income and highest unemployment and highest rates of lowest rates in housing, home ownership. We are hoping that the Minnesota Migration Act will address some of those disparities that we are currently facing in health, family, reconciliation, and financial difficulties that we suffer here in Minnesota. And today we're just asking that it be considered here in this hearing. Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. Next on the list, I have Jane Prince. If you can introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Muted. Yes, I'm Jane Prince, and I serve on the St. Paul City Council. Thanks to the members of the House Judiciary, Finance, and Civil Law Committee for considering this important and groundbreaking legislation. As mentioned, the City of St. Paul passed the St. Paul Recovery Act and Community Reparations Resolution in January of 21. By way of that resolution, the City Council made formal apology for the specific ways in which African-American people in our city have been discriminated against, including through real estate redlining, racial covenants on housing deeds, and most significantly, in the destruction of St. Paul's vibrant and growing Black middle-class neighborhood in 300 Business District, which was bulldozed to make way for Interstate 94 in the 50s. Like Evanston, Illinois, St. Paul's resolution will lead to the creation of a reparations commission, which will be appointed in 2023 to address disparities resulting from city policies and ordinances over the past 50 years. My ancestors did not own slaves, but my family did benefit from an unfair system that raised up people who look like me and held back the hopes and dreams of African Americans. My dad was a US Army infantry fighter in terrible combat in the Pacific in World War II. When he came home after the war, he and my mom were able to use the GI Bill to build a home to raise my brother, sister, and I, which went on to provide home equity loans to send us to college and launch my successful life. For African-American GIs returning from the same combat, the GI Bill was meaningless. They were unable to get bank loans and mortgages to go to school and buy homes for their new and growing families. Generational wealth that fell to me and my family was not available to that entire generation of Black veterans with the same benefits. For another source of support for this bill, I have put in the link that Mr. Cruz referred to from the New England Journal of Medicine, stating that reparations is ultimately the best way to close the racial health gap that has led to all the other Black-white disparities in housing, education, fair wages, and safe workplaces. Please support this bill. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your testimony. Next, I have Delshia Perry. If you can introduce yourself and go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair and the committee members, especially Representative John Thompson, for the work that you have done and have continued to do. I'm so grateful for Traren Cruz, who's been working diligently with reparations. I just want to talk real quick about the health and wellness piece. As you all know, my name is Delshia Perry. I am the president and founder of Be Their Voices. Many of you have heard my story and why I started this organization. But what I wanted to talk about tonight was the health and wellness and the disparities in that area. And I believe that there should be a certain percentage of professional Black healthcare providers, not just in Minnesota, but of course in our jails. Because if that had been the case when my son was in custody, we may not be talking about Hardell Sherrill, a case of Naja Khan Powell, a case of Amity Dimmick with Kobe Heisler. So I just believe that with all of the disparities in the Black community, we certainly must do something about the health and wellness of Black individuals in the state of Minnesota, and not just continue to talk about it, but to be about it. And I know that John Thompson is doing an amazing job, and I just take my hat off to you for the work that you're doing. And I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming on and allowing me the opportunity to express my thank yous for the work that everyone is doing. And I certainly hope that you all will take this into serious consideration and give this bill the passage that it needs to move forward, because we certainly need all the help that we can get. And as Representative John Thompson said, this conversation is well overdue. So thank you again for your time this evening. I thank you all. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next on the list, I have Pamela Gojiri. Hopefully I said that right. Please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Good evening. My name is Reverend Pamela Gojiri. I am one of the co-directors for racial justice here at the Minnesota Council of Churches. The Minnesota Council of Churches is a premier statewide council constituted by its 27-member historical Black church, mainline Protestant, Pentecostal, and Orthodox judicatories, representing about 1 million members. Our mission is to manifest the unity in the body of Christ and to build a common good in the world. The rationale for our work presupposes that an organization with our membership and strong interfaith partners is well situated to lead the envisioned process for change. Much of the work is on a larger scale beyond what an individual denomination could address on their own. After the murder of George Floyd, amidst the racial unrest that gripped the Twin Cities, the board of MCC began a deep conversation asking what the church must do to be about the work of healing and repair. This led to the creation of our 3-tier Truth, Education, and Reparations program. Truth-telling is the sharing of stories of harm from the Native American and African American communities with white congregations to begin the process of breaking down the myths and lies that are put forward about Natives and Blacks. Education is the participation of congregations in programming that continues breaking down stereotypes and misinformation. Reparations is the work of repairing the harm caused by systemic racism, as there has never been an equitable relationship between dominant white culture and Native and Black folks in this country. The playing field has never been level. These two communities are the foundation of the ongoing racism that affects other people groups here in this country. We have to start at the beginning and de-root the problem. If these two groups are humanized, the rest of the BIPOC communities will reap the benefits of this change as well. Reparations is what should have been given after slavery ended and what should have been honored by the treaties that the government made with the Native Americans in this country in preparation for success in their new lives, new status, and with their new citizenship. We at MCC support the intent of the Minnesota Migration Act, which aligns with our work, and we will walk alongside the partners in this ongoing process. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Next on the list, I have Jeremy English. Please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Hello, committee. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chairman Becky Finn. Thank you, Vice Chair Moeller. And I kind of want to just talk about a little bit about the committee piece of the Migration Act, because that's one of the most beautiful pieces of it. And I can kind of give you kind of a diagram by kind of describing the St. Paul Recovery Act. I am a steering committee member of the St. Paul Recovery Act. And basically, the council resolution calls for the creation of a limited legislative advisory committee, which will work with the city administration to create a framework in the city codes for a permanent commission to be known as the St. Paul Recovery Act Reparations Commission. The commission will be empowered to make short, medium, long-term recommendations specifically to address the creation of generational wealth for Black Americans, descendants of chattel slavery, to boost economic mobility and opportunity in the Black community. Well, when you look at the Migration Act, it is kind of some of the same framework. The steering committee shall issue a written report of the steering committee's findings and make recommendations to the legislative committee with jurisdiction over human rights to identify the form of compensation that should be awarded and the mechanisms through which it should be dispersed, and those persons who should be eligible for the compensation. So when you look at HF number 3850, it really is a great committee and a great step that the state could take to acknowledge that they are ready to make a historical move forward in regards to studying reparations for Black Americans and kind of repairing some of those issues that we've had on a state level. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your testimony. Next, I have Nick Muhammad. Please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the rest of the council here. Primarily, I'm asking you all to support HF House File 3850, shortly put in light of everything that everybody's already put on the table as far as the data. Reparations is essential to the practice of eliminating racial disparities in the state of Minnesota. We already know that the current trajectory that we're on pertaining to the American descendants of chattel slavery is not maintainable, and the historical context is grossly misunderstood by many, which helps us to continue to kick the can down the road, and we continue to misunderstand what we're dealing with. Now, this bill is needed to establish not only the historical context, but the impact of the politically fortified systemic racism embodied in our current disparities. But it's also the process of which to establish resources so that we can actually forge a pathway forward in addressing these things in a long-term solution. Now, due to the practice of these historical narratives and suppressing the actual true historical context, the racial impetus and the context of many of the federal, state, and municipal laws and ordinances are critically misunderstood. And as far as their impact on our community, people don't understand why we have certain outcomes in the Black community or the ADOS community as opposed to some of our counterparts. That context is embedded inside of the process of reparations. The historical context of the crime that's happened to the Black community is grossly misunderstood. And that's why I want you all to support the House File 3850 moving forward, because right now we're on a trajectory where the median household income of the average Black family in the country and the state of Minnesota is projected to be zero. We already have a 95.4% per capita homeless rate inside of the Black community, where everybody else is under 30%. This is simply not maintainable. And we've already ran down the data on home ownership, which is a catalyst for wealth creation in any community. And we haven't even touched on the lack of critical business infrastructure and industry in order to be able to hire and pay our own eligible workforce. Now, these are things that the state of Minnesota is in a great position to actually wrestle with, but we just have to take the political will and fortitude to move studies like this forward so that we can actually establish the historical context and how deep the well goes, and more importantly, what we're going to need in order to begin to address it. Back to you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much for your testimony. Next up, I have Ben Imchi. If you can introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
For the record, the name is Ben Mackay. Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to speak on behalf of House File 3850. Again, my name is Benjamin Mackay. I'm an educational consultant, and I work on curriculum reform applied to teacher candidates to build a stronger workforce in that hallowed profession. The departments that I have worked with are at the University of St. Thomas and also Metro State University School of Urban Education. We are currently working in Minnesota State College's Southeast in Goodhue and Wabasha County. I am also a member of the Reparations Advisory Committee for the City of St. Paul. The Minnesota racial wealth gap is driven by public policy. Wealth defined as the net worth of a person, the total value of assets minus liabilities. State of Minnesota has the third worst racial wealth gap in America. The racial wealth gap did not become a reality because of lack of labor. Instead, it is coming from a lack of financial capital. Income is the amount of money that a person receives in return for their services, sales, and goods, or profit from investment. Now, a recession, we've had two of them this century, impacts everyone, but wealth is distributed so unevenly in Minnesota that Mr. Muhammad's testimony speaks to the kind of numbers that the African-American community is dealing with. The lack of government-sponsored safety nets was apparent in the wake of the economic disaster like the 2008 housing crisis, or a natural disaster, such as Hurricane Katrina in 2005. With COVID and the Eastern European conflict in front of us right now, causing inflation, another downturn is entirely possible. The advisory committee that I sit on discusses, among other things, reparations allocations ranging from down payment housing revitalization grants to student loan forgiveness for qualified descendants of American chattel slavery. Redress focuses on investment, not expense. As former Senator Wellstone said, when we all do better, we all do better. Please consider House File 3850 to pass and make its way through committees to reach the governor's desk. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Mackay, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name the first time. Next up, I have Professor Andy Johnson. Please introduce yourself for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Dr. Andy Johnson. I teach cross-cultural psychology and motivation classes at Bethel University. My students have been involved in project-based learning experiences regarding homelessness, poverty, interpersonal violence, and other issues in the Frogtown Summit University neighborhoods over the past several years. In recent projects over the past 2 years related to income and housing, my students and I have discovered some very unsettling information, much of which has been covered by my colleagues here. I'm going to limit my comments to the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is substantial and persistent over time, rooted in a history of systematic oppression and inequality. On the national level, the median income for whites in the states is several times higher than the median income for people of African ancestry, African Americans. We see negative effects, as many have noted, even in the state of Minnesota. For example, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, St. Paul per capita income for the 5-year period beginning in 2013 is less than $16,000 on average for African Americans in comparison to over $42,000 for whites. St. Paul homeownership for the same 5-year period is under 17% for African Americans in comparison to over 61% for whites. I want to make it clear that once we started the project, there was one group of students involved, and they were looking at the issue of reparations, and they thought, well, this is such a controversial thing. We need to prepare a project on how can we motivate people to even become involved in the discussion. And what they found, in contrast to other projects that other students were doing on other problems, is just when people become aware of the statistics and the severe nature of the wealth gap, that's really all motivation that they needed. And they were very surprised at how willing people were to discuss these issues. But in short, something needs to be done. The Minnesota Migration Act sets aside funds for systematic exploration of the problem. Now, Jones and McElderry last year published an article saying that there are two basic reasons that have been used to pursue reparations. The first one is the idea that responsible entities have a legal obligation to remedy past harms. The second is that there's a moral obligation to address injustices rooted in slavery, lynching, redlining, and other atrocities. And I would add that there's emerging evidence, research evidence, that suggests a third reason in addition to those noted by Jones and McElderry, and that is the issue of effectiveness. Peters, in an article in February of this year, reports on the results of pilot studies in Vancouver and places ranging from Newark, New Jersey to Chicago that show that cash payments have a surprising effect, and sometimes very modest cash payments have a surprising positive effect on addressing homelessness and can do so more effectively than standard procedures in place.
Mr. Johnson, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Okay, in conclusion, although Minnesota was a leader at one time, we're not in a leadership position in terms of addressing the racial wealth gap at present. Collecting evidence to guide future policies to reduce the racial wealth and other disparities is needed, and I personally support HF 3850 as a step forward in this process. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. Next, I have Professor Tandon Brecky. Please introduce yourself and go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and other members of the committee. My name is Dr. Tandon Brecky. I'm an associate professor and assistant director for service learning and community engagement at Bethel University. I've had the joy of doing university community partnership work or developing university and community partnerships for the last 15 years. And about a year and a half ago, one of our community partners, the Community Stabilization Project, said, hey, there's some really beautiful work happening with the St. Paul Recovery Act. You need to learn more about it. And when community partners tell me that, I'm like, okay, I got to key into that beautiful work. And so we started connecting with Traherne Cruz and Council Member Prince at that time, and learn more about what the beautiful work that's happening with the St. Paul Recovery Act. And over the last year, we've got students and faculty connected on that project. And then we'll continue working with the Minnesota Migration Act. There's two things I want to emphasize here with this kind of work that I think is crucial, that I've learned and connected with my faculty and the students that I work with. One is the meaningfulness of this work. The students the emerging leaders, the way I would like to refer to our students, they realize that we have issues, serious issues around racial inequality. And they realize that we can't just keep addressing the symptoms. We have to go to the core of the issue. And the students that I've got connected to this kind of work see that this work is connecting to the core of what's happening, what has happened and what's currently happening. So it's meaningful in the sense that it's going to address the core. And that's been already addressed, why that's the core by my esteemed colleagues. The other piece for us, I work at a religious institution, specifically Christian. I'm a trained Christian pastor, and our religious tradition teaches us that the wrongs or the sins have to be dealt with in a way that actually acknowledges them and does some repair to address those harms. Sin doesn't just evaporate, it's only dealt with when we repent and change our behavior. And the students and faculty that I work with identify this work closely with their religious convictions. And so I bring that knowledge to us today that religion reminds us that we must confess what's happened and then take concrete action. And I would say that this bill is a significant step along that journey. So thank you.
All right, thank you for your testimony. That wraps up our testimony. I want to thank all the testifiers and really appreciate everybody. I didn't really have to cut anybody off, and really appreciate folks being respectful of each other with their testimony today.
No, with all due respect, I wanted to ask for 10 million. I think this is a long overdue conversation, and you can't put a price tag. But I want to be, I don't want to go outrageous, but I want to make sure that the work is done right. And so when we come to the $2 million conclusion, it was a meeting between all of us and said, well, we can get this done. You know, a lot of times we try to do the work, and I've always seen several studies by people about us, by people who don't look like us, and they don't get an accurate synopsis of what we really need in our community. So this was driven by people who actually want to do this work and have this conversation. I'm always willing to, for me as a union, I was a machinist, but I was also part of the bargaining unit. And I've always heard that there's always a different price. So honestly, we just need what everybody else need in the community, and that's help, like getting this piece of legislation off the ground and moving. And hopefully we could actually all come together. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Thompson. And I will say too that, it would be my intention with laying this over that we would work with the Department of Human Rights, since this would be through the department, to make sure that we're going about this in the best way to get to the results that we're all looking for. Follow-up, Representative Scott.
No further follow-up, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Thompson, for authoring the bill, and thank you, community members, and all those that testified and shared your knowledge, your lived experience, and your expertise. It was needed today. And this is a conversation, and I agree, Representative Thompson, it is long overdue. In fact, not only in the state of Minnesota, but in this country. We have an original sin of chattel slavery. We know that. We can directly draw a lot of disparities and inequities that we have in this country back to that original sin. The problem that we've had is having a real deep, serious, and thoughtful, sincere conversation about that, and then taking action to correct those wrongs. We see it every day. I see it every day in these committees when we try to bring forth policies to correct past historical wrongs, and there's a lot of pushback against that. So this conversation is long overdue. I'm looking forward to working with the chair and figuring out how we can get it moving forward and actually make something happen. I think it's a way to help not only the state of Minnesota heal from those past wrongs, but maybe we can be a model to the country. Thank you for bringing the bill.
Thank you, Representative Frazier.
I'm not saying it's not there, but we need information that we can actually look up and find out information on. And with that, I'll let the chair lay it over.
Great. Thank you, Representative Johnson. And I'll just say, I'm going to start with a place of, I really hope that folks took more away from the testimony today than Googling some organizations. I think what really came through to me in the testimony today was how important these efforts are. And again, we're laying this over. Nobody's going to be voting on it today. We're laying this over so we can get this right. And at that time we can talk about that. But I think to assume that there's going to be any mismanagement of anything, we're just laying this bill over today, is a little premature. So again, just really want to thank the testifiers. Representative Thompson, any closing comments before we lay this over?
Real quick, for 403 years, American descendants of chattel slavery have endured subhuman treatment in America. Often we talk about slavery here, like we think of Southern plantations, and few acknowledge like the connection to slavery right here in Minnesota. Like, for instance, 1840, you're talking about Dred Scott, Dred and Harriet Scott, who were like even through slavery. This is a conversation. You're right, that was well overdue. I want to share something. This is my honest thought. Right now, we're still in chains. Some may have platinum chains, some may have gold chains, some may have silver chains, and they brag about them. Look, my chain's silver. Look, my chain's gold. But we're all still in chains. And I'm not just talking about Black people. I'm not just talking about African Americans. Here's what I also will share. Currently, when we think about it, post George Floyd came here for drug rehab and a job training. He wanted to be a truck driver. Instead, we fed him fentanyl, and ultimately we killed him. And I'm talking about the entire state of Minnesota. And so I want to I'll share that we're not going to see the fruit of our labor here. Everybody here on this call, we will not see the fruit of our labor. Right now, we're actually living and benefiting off the fruit of the man that's behind me, some of the hard work that this man put in. Our kids, I have a 13-year-old son, and I'm hoping that my son will benefit off of some of the decisions that we make. Because we can no longer go back to, we're still asking for things that Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and some other civil rights, we're still asking for these things in 2022. And so I know that this conversation is well overdue. I want to say thank you to everybody on this committee for allowing me to have this conversation. A lot of times we attack people, but we don't attack the problem. And I'm ready to attack the problem. And I want to say thank you again for having me. Please consider this bill as important legislation for you.
Thank you, Representative Thompson. Again, thank you to all of our testifiers. It was really important to hear from all of you today, and really appreciated folks hanging in there for this late committee hearing. With that, House File 3850 is laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. That brings us to the last bill on our agenda today.
This has been a Black Watch Television News Update.